I'll tell you right now, Double Dragon Gaiden: Rise of the Dragons is the best Double Dragon game ever made. By a frankly absurd margin. None of its predecessors ever looked this good or handled this well. I've beaten the campaign several times now, and I'm still looking forward to going back and trying out different characters and moves. It is the most fun entry this franchise has produced in over a decade, and I'm having an absolute blast with it. But that got me wondering, what really makes this a Double Dragon game other than the title? I was surprised by how difficult it was for me to name any of the chief identifying characteristics of a Double Dragon game. All of its most unique innovations became standards of the genre long ago. Two-player cooperative play, special moves, and the ability to pick up and use enemy weapons were revolutionary in 1987, but now, every beat-em-up has those things. They're so ubiquitous that it feels odd if a game doesn't have them. Even the story. Bad guy kidnaps your girl, so you gotta fight every gang in town to get her back, is one of the most repeated tropes in the history of video games. So much so that some games, like the River City Girls series, can build their entire premise on just subverting this classic plot. Now that every game in the 30 years since has copied all of its best moves, what really sets a Double Dragon apart from all the other retro beat-em-ups out there? Definitely not the heroes. Bimmy and Jimmy Lee are as generic as video game protagonists come, with only a color scheme, and later haircuts, to differentiate them. They don't even have a consistent design from game to game. The only thing we know about them for sure is that they are brothers who practice a fictitious martial art that is rarely mentioned outside of the instruction booklets and promotional materials. Hell, they're not even always the heroes. In the NES port of the first game, Jimmy is actually the surprise final boss. Marion is usually the love interest of one, or both, brothers, and is frequently damseled or fridged to give them a reason to beat up every goon in the city. Some tie-in media and later games would depict her as a cop capable of taking care of herself. Marion is a quite unique and formidable playable character in Double Dragon Gaiden, as she uses a gun rather than her fists. Although ostensibly the holy trinity of the franchise, Billy, Jimmy, and Marion don't appear in every game. No, the most consistent character in the entire franchise is Abobo. The puffy muscle man with the signature frown wasn't even a boss fight in his early appearances, just one of the most visually distinct henchmen. But Abobo is the closest thing the franchise has to a mascot. From a slightly skewed perspective, the entire Double Dragon series is about how a young and ambitious street thug named Abobo fought his way up through the ranks of the Shadow Warriors to become the leader of his own gang. Who knows? If he keeps up the hard work, maybe one day Abobo will graduate to final boss status. For now, he often serves as the ambassador of Double Dragon, making guest appearances in other brawlers, like the aforementioned River City Girls games. He was even the star of his very own fan game, but that's a tangent for another time. Dang. So, other than the title, what makes anything a part of the Double Dragon universe? We know it isn't a shred of shared story because the first 3 games had about 10 lines of text combined, which every subsequent entry completely ignored. There is no persistent lore. Sometimes you're just fighting a bunch of street punks with a gimmick, but in a few games, alien monsters and eldritch horrors from beyond sanity are among your foes, with zero explanation for their presence. In the short-lived cartoon series from 1993, Billy and Jimmy are basically twin mystic ninjas that fight the forces of darkness with magic swords that shoot beams of light. The movie is about a pair of goofball bros pursuing two halves of a magical amulet across the post-nuclear dystopia of New Angeles, and mostly avoid showing too much martial arts action in favor of extended car and boat chases. Two things that were never part of the source material. We know Double Dragon isn't about beloved, recognizable characters. With the odd exception of Abobo, the series doesn't even boast a stable of villains that fans love to hate. The likes of Machine Gun Willie and the Shadow Boss can't even light a candle in the pantheon of amazing video game antagonists like Bowser or Handsome Jack. The movie's villain, Kogashuko, is just an aggro weeaboo douchebag who walks around smoking while he says ridiculous things and chews the scenery. Skullmageddon, the greatest, most memorable villain the series ever produced, was literally a joke. And he only got one game as the bad guy before being demoted to shopkeeper status in River City Girls. A tragic waste. We can also deduce that Double Dragon is not about the combat mechanics, because they change drastically with every installment. Finding two games within the series that handle and feel relatively the same is not easy. Double Dragon 2 and 3 are more like completely different games than direct sequels, while Double Dragon 5 belongs to an entirely different genre. And in an example of the dragon eating its own tail, the 1995 Neo Geo game, confusingly titled just Double Dragon, was a one-on-one fighting game based on the 1994 movie, which was based on the original game from 1987. The ultra-stylized Double Dragon Neon was hailed as the triumphant return of the franchise back in 2012. But the installments that followed discarded everything Neon introduced, including Skullmageddon. Then, in 2017, Double Dragon 4, a throwback so retro it was actually regressive, was released well over 20 years after Double Dragon 5 had been declared the death of the franchise. I swear, the chronology of this series could give an aspirin a headache. But the latest entry, Double Dragon Gaiden: Rise of the Dragons, is more fun to play than all of them, despite its relative historical irrelevance. The combat is fast and punchy. The game throws a wide variety of enemy types at you and isn't afraid to occasionally flood the screen with foes, something previous entries simply couldn't handle. Every playable character has their own unique playstyle. Even the Lee brothers are more different from each other than they've ever been, each with their own stats and movesets. There's even a mechanic where you can tag in a second character to extend your combos to epic lengths. I suppose Super Double Dragon walked painfully slow so that one day Gaiden could dash attack. Perhaps at some future date it will be remembered as the game that brought Double Dragon back for a modern audience. Only time will tell. That still doesn't answer the question I have right now. What defines a Double Dragon in the year 2024? We've established that it isn't the story, characters, mechanics, style, or even genre. So, what makes Gaiden a Double Dragon game at all? Is it just the title and the theme song? It's so strange that one of the oldest and most influential video game franchises of all time has absolutely no canon of any kind to unify its many entries. Usually, by this point in the video, I've reached some new insight about the topic at hand, but today, that moment is stubbornly refusing to occur. I guess there isn't anything coherent tying these games together. Maybe Double Dragon is really Abobo's world after all, and the Lee brothers are just troublesome trespassers that won't stay off his turf. That makes about as much sense as anything else in the series. But if you are looking for a classic retro beat-em-up, Gaiden provides an experience comparable to the button bashers of legend, with plenty of modern bells and whistles to make it more fun than those antique quarter munchers. Hopefully we won't have to wait another decade for the next one.